I find woodlands to be one of the most challenging subjects to try and photograph. Woodland landscapes are busy, chaotic places, and trying to isolate effective photographic compositions among the chaos of twigs, branches, and foliage can sometimes seem overwhelming. On the other hand, woodlands are simply amazing places to spend time. I'm lucky enough to live in rural Oxfordshire, and here, whilst I may not have my favourite coastal or mountainous landscapes to photograph, we do have a huge variety of stunning woodlands right on our doorstep. Taking a walk through these ancient places really feels like stepping back in time. The woods are teeming with wildlife, and really there can be few pleasures greater than strolling through an ancient woodland on a misty morning to the soundtrack of the dawn chorus. Here in the UK, the majority of us have access to some kind of woodland not too far from home, whether that's an ancient oak forest, an artificial plantation, or even just a corner of your local public park. Spending time in these places and maybe creating an image that captures the spirit of them can really be one of the greatest pleasures in landscape photography. For many of us, the restrictions of the past year have led us to turn to our local woodlands as a place of refuge away from the stresses and pressures of everyday life. It has certainly been my local woodlands that have sustained both my photography as well as my mental well-being through this difficult year. In this video, I'll be providing some insights into my approach to photographing these atmospheric landscapes, from the best conditions to photograph woodland scenes to how I approach identifying compositions. Woodlands can certainly be a challenging landscape to photograph, but with a little perseverance, they can also be one of the most rewarding. If there's one phrase that turns up again and again in any discussion of woodland photography, it's creating order from chaos. It may seem that this phrase is overused, but more often than not, this is the key to successful woodland photography. For this reason, woodland photography, perhaps more so than for other genres of landscape photography, relies heavily on having the right conditions that will enable you to isolate a subject in your image. The one condition that can really transform woodland scenes, more so than any other, is mist. Misty mornings, in my opinion, provide by far the best conditions for woodland photography. Mist helps to isolate subjects and create atmosphere in your images. Mist creates separation between the subject of an image and the noise that would otherwise cause a distraction in the scene. Mist creates atmosphere and mystery, and it's this that will turn an otherwise potentially mundane patch of woodland into something truly special. Knowing when and where mist is likely to occur can be difficult to predict. Weather apps can be useful for predicting fog and mist, but often patches of mist can be highly localised and do not appear in these forecasts. It's therefore best to look out for the kind of conditions that tend to favour mist formation. Mist normally forms when air humidity is close to 100%, and the difference between the dew point and the air temperature is less than 2.5 degrees. An app such as Clear Outside that provides these figures can therefore be very useful to help predict when mist might arrive. In addition, mist normally comes following a period of high pressure, when cold nights lead to a layer of cold air close to the ground. This colder air causes the moisture in the air to condense, leading to mist or fog. For this reason, the colder months of autumn and winter tend to be more favourable for misty conditions. Mist and fog tends to occur in the autumn and winter. However, in summer, haze may provide a similar effect that will help with your woodland compositions. Whereas mist is formed from water drops that condense in the air, haze is formed by suspended dust particles. When the sun is high enough to cast rays through the woodland canopy, haze can help to create sunbeams that can themselves provide a focal point in woodland images. When it comes to woodland photography, of course the best time of year is usually autumn. Just being in the woods when the leaves have turned to different shades of orange, yellows and reds can be one of the best experiences in nature. Fortunately, autumn is also one of the most likely times of year to experience misty conditions as the temperature starts to drop and there's still a lot of humidity in the air. What we're all hoping for in the autumn is a misty morning that coincides with a peak of autumn colour. And although such mornings are elusive, when everything does come together, these are the days when you absolutely need to be making the most of your woodland photography. Winter similarly can be a great time for woodland photography, and in particular, snow or heavy frost can lead to some stunning images. Throughout the months of January and February, the woods can seem like dreary places, but with a bit of frost and snow, they can be transformed into a winter wonderland. Spring can be an amazing time to be out in the woods, as the first green shoots are starting to emerge and the wildlife really starts to wake up after the winter. Of course, late spring is also when the bluebells start to emerge. Photographing bluebells at their peak can sometimes be a race against time, as they tend to only last a couple of weeks, but it's well worth it. The bluebells normally emerge at their best for around 2 weeks from the middle of April, depending on which part of the country you're in. Of course, other wildflowers can also be used to create stunning images, so look out for snowdrops in February and wild garlic from April to June. Summer in general, I find can be quite a difficult time for landscape photography in the UK. It can be a real struggle to drag yourself out of bed in time for sunrise, and the woods at this time of year are normally bright green and thick with foliage, making it particularly difficult to find interesting compositions. I'll normally switch primarily to wildlife and macro photography at this time of year, but it can still be possible to create some interesting images when the conditions are right, so I'll often bring a landscape lens with me on those trips. Towards the end of summer, you'll often find those nice hazy conditions that when coupled with shafts of light will create some truly magical images. Light is another factor that can be used to help create compositions in woodland photography. Often I'll look for small patches of light illuminating trunks or branches, or particular patches of leaves. Light can help provide further separation of your subject from the darker surroundings, again providing that much needed isolation in your images. A particular patch of woodland being illuminated by a shaft of light can provide a focal point for the viewer's eye. Look for areas of contrasting light and dark, perhaps bands of light that can themselves be used to create a lead-in line for your image. It can often be a good idea to try and exclude the sky from your woodland images, as this can form a distraction. However, I do find that sun stars can sometimes work well, adding an extra focal point to your image. To achieve a sun star, I decrease my aperture to f16 or f18, and I'll usually bracket these images as well to make sure that I capture the full dynamic range of the scene. When presented with a thick wood of trees, it can be particularly hard to know where to start with finding a photographic composition. My approach is to try and identify a particular tree or perhaps multiple trees that stand out as having unique personalities. Anthropomorphism in woodlands will often lead to good images, and I like to keep an eye out for trees that appear to have a particular character. I also like to look out for groups of trees that appear to tell some form of story or narrative. Try to look for single trees that stand out as being different, or groups of trees that appear to be interacting with each other. Often, finding these scenes is just a case of walking around the woods, keeping your mind open to anything that jumps out at you, as being slightly different from the surroundings. This could be a young sapling, maybe a species of tree that is on its own surrounded by other species, or an old dead tree surrounded by living ones. Sometimes I find it helps to imagine that these trees are characters playing out a particular scene or story. If you can imagine that there is a story that lies behind a particular scene, then often someone viewing your image will similarly be able to either consciously or subconsciously see the story in that image as well. I like to compose most of my landscape images using the viewfinder of my camera rather than the back screen, and I particularly recommend using this approach when photographing woodlands. Composing through the viewfinder can really help you to focus on your composition and cut out the other distractions happening around you. This can be particularly useful in woodland photography. Paths and tracks through woodlands, whether man-made or made by wildlife, can also be extremely useful for creating lead-in lines that will draw the viewer deeper into your image. In particular, it's good to look out for S-curves in paths. Personally, I tend to prefer animal tracks to man-made tracks, as I like my images to show natural features rather than human influence in the landscape. But often a footpath can be used to create a great composition, so I'm not afraid to include one when needed. An important factor for woodland photography is building up familiarity with your locations, and this is where having a local spot that you can visit regularly and reach easily can be a real benefit. Good conditions for woodland photography, when they come, are often short-lived, so it can be really helpful if you already know where the good compositions will be, as you can then make the most of conditions when they do arrive, without feeling too stressed. I have several locations that I can reach within just 10 or 15 minutes from my home. I spend many days exploring these woods, not just for woodland photography but also for wildlife photography. And during these trips, I'm always on the lookout for interesting trees and compositions that would work well in the right conditions. Having a short list of potential spots means that on days when conditions are right, I can easily get to the woods and make the most of them. I'm a big fan of creating large, stitched panoramas of woodlands that really show the character of the trees in different seasons. In contrast to most woodland photographs, for me the aim of these particular panoramas is to show off the trunks, branches or foliage of a wood itself, without necessarily having a main focal point of interest in the image. And this really is one of my favourite ways of capturing the spirit of woodlands in images. One area of photography that I do like to experiment with in woodlands is intimate landscape and abstract photography. Sometimes, particularly if you're struggling to find a wider composition or if the conditions aren't quite right for traditional woodland photography, photographing more intimate scenes can work really well. I like to look out for colours and textures, for example in pieces of bark or in the leaves or on the woodland floor. Intimate landscape photography is a genre in its own right, and definitely one that I enjoy, although finding intimate compositions that work can be a real challenge. Similar to the panoramas, sometimes I find that creating triptychs or square images that pick out particular branches can work really nicely to show off a particular character of a woodland. Another approach that can be well suited to woodlands is the use of intentional camera movement, or ICM. This is where using a longer exposure and intentionally moving the camera during the exposure is used to create a more abstract image. This isn't to everyone's taste, but it can be extremely enjoyable and can also be used to create some really interesting abstract images. One approach I've also turned to on days when there's a bit of a breeze is, rather than trying to freeze the movement of the leaves, I opt for a longer exposure and embrace the movement to create more abstract images. I really like these kind of images, and in particular, I like the effect that the moving leaves have in contrast to the stationary trunks and branches of the trees. Woodland photography is normally a bit more forgiving than other types of landscape photography when it comes to settings. In contrast to most other forms of landscape photography where you generally want to maximise your depth of field, in woodlands, as you're normally trying to isolate a subject, it can often work better to use slightly wider apertures. The sweet point for sharpness for most lenses is actually around f8, so when photographing woodlands I'll often turn to f8 because I don't really need the added depth of field of going higher. However, if I'm including areas of foreground interest and I need to have more depth of field in my images, I will increase the f-stop up to f11. For more intimate images, or images where I'm trying to completely isolate a leaf or a twig for example, I may even go wider, using a wide aperture to throw my backgrounds out of focus. Woodland photography really can be a struggle, and many of us find it to be one of the most frustrating forms of landscape photography. However, as difficult as it can be, sometimes it's best just to enjoy being in these truly remarkable places. Woodlands have a fascination about them. They can seem eerie at times and ancient. Stepping into a truly ancient patch of woodland can feel like stepping back in time, and often it can feel that these scenes are the same as our ancestors would have seen thousands of years ago. Woodlands are magical places, and when the conditions are right, being able to capture this magic in an image can be one of the greatest pleasures in landscape photography.